HOA bulldozed my water barrier, then watched in terror as their homes were swept away. What happens when someone's thirst for control becomes more dangerous than the threat they ignore? I had lived at Willow Creek Estates for just over 6 months before realizing that peace and quiet in the suburbs came with a heavy toll, and her name was Marcia Whitmore. The newly elected president of our HOA, she was sharp-lipped, never seen without her beige heels, and had an ego inflated larger than our town's welcome sign. It all started when I built a temporary flood barrier line of reinforced sandbags, gravel, and wooden support beams at the rear of my property. I live at the base of a slope, where seasonal rains always threaten to turn our yards into marshlands. Last year, I spent thousands fixing water damage. This year, I promised myself I wouldn't let that happen again. But apparently, Marcia had other plans. She showed up one Thursday morning, clipboard in hand and sunglasses perched on her nose like a movie villain. "You're disrupting the visual harmony of the neighborhood," she sniffed, motioning toward the structure. "This thing violates HOA codes 3B, 7F, and 9C. "I'm just trying to prevent flooding," I said, trying to stay calm. "We're expecting heavy rain this weekend." "That's your problem, not the neighborhood's. We can't have everyone building fortresses." "It's not a fortress. It's a barrier temporary. Remove it by tomorrow, or I'll have it removed for you." She smiled smugly. I filed an appeal that afternoon. Rejected. No surprise. And despite my warnings about the coming storm, she doubled down. 2 days later, I came home to find the barrier gone. Bulldozed. Literally. A contractor hired by the HOA had scraped the entire structure into a pile of rubble by the edge of my property line. And just like that, the last protection we had was gone. That night, the storm came. Heavy rains pummeled the hills. Thunder cracked across the sky like a warning shot, and the wind howled with the kind of ferocity you feel in your ribs. Around 2 a.m., I heard the roar of water. I rushed to the backyard, flashlight trembling in my hand, just in time to see it. A wall of runoff tearing down the slope, smashing into the exact spot where the barrier had stood. It didn't stop at my property. It kept going straight into the backyards of the 6 houses behind mine. Water flooded basement windows. Outdoor furniture was swept away like toys. I watched helplessly as the home of an elderly couple 2 doors down was swallowed to the waist in murky water. Their golden retriever barked from the 2nd-floor balcony, stranded. But here's the twist. Someone caught everything on camera. My neighbor's teenage daughter, Leah, had been working on a documentary project for school about community conflicts. She had been filming Marcia's confrontation with me a few days earlier from her bedroom window. Then, unbelievably, she left her GoPro running the night of the storm, mounted on her balcony. The footage was gold. It showed the barrier in place, Marcia ordering it removed, the bulldozer scraping it away, me pleading with her, and finally the flood. It was irrefutable. But here's the real kicker. Leah's dad is a reporter for the local news station. By noon the next day, the story was already on air. HOA negligence leads to flood disaster. Local homes damaged after warning ignored. Marcia's face was everywhere, frozen mid-shout, pointing like some suburban dictator. The footage played on loop, her waving that clipboard like a sword. My warnings, the aftermath, tears, mud, crushed dreams. But justice didn't stop there. A class action lawsuit formed by the affected homeowners hit the HOA within 48 hours. My insurance company even jumped in to demand damages. But the biggest blow came when the city inspector revealed something shocking. The barrier I built did not violate any municipal codes. In fact, the HOA had overstepped its authority entirely. Marcia acted illegally. The city launched an investigation. The council suspended her pending review. The contractor fined for destruction of private property. And Marcia? She tried to claim she was just following rules, but the smug mask cracked. At a community meeting, when pressed about why she ignored repeated warnings of flood risk, she stammered. "Because it looked ugly. It didn't belong here." People gasped. Some laughed. Most just stared in disbelief. Her allies? Silent. Her friends? Gone. I watched her stumble out of that meeting red-faced, drenched not in water but in shame. She sold her home quietly 3 weeks later, moved out in the middle of the night. And me? I rebuilt the barrier stronger, taller, with full city permits. But I also planted a small wooden sign at the edge of my yard, facing the neighborhood. When control replaces care, consequences flood in. By the end of that week, the neighborhood no longer whispered about Marcia, they spoke her name openly, with equal parts contempt and disbelief. The disaster had shifted something fundamental in Willow Creek Estates. Where once people stayed behind white fences and passive-aggressive smiles, now they knocked on each other's doors. They helped each other clear out soggy basements, drag ruined furniture to the curb, and pass around trays of coffee and sandwiches. Ironically, the flood that washed away our peace also uncovered something deep: a need for real connection, not control. But Marcia didn't go quietly. 2 days after her resignation was announced, she showed up on my porch. Uninvited, pale, hollow-eyed. Her designer coat looked like it had been slept in. There was no clipboard this time, just a trembling hand holding a manila envelope. "I just came to say." She paused, visibly struggling. "You made me look like a monster." I stared at her, caught between rage and disbelief. "I didn't make you do anything, Marcia. You did this. To all of us." "I was trying to maintain standards," she whispered. "Order. That's what an HOA is for." I crossed my arms. "No, Marcia. It's supposed to serve people, not power." She stood there another moment, then held out the envelope. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "But you should know. This isn't the first time something like this happened. You're not the only one." I took the envelope. She turned and walked away. Inside was a trove of documents, emails, old letters, printed complaints. It was a record of her reign. Basically, neighbors she'd silenced, fined unfairly, bullied into submission. Some had even moved away to escape her. One elderly man, Mr. Daniels, had apparently tried to install a wheelchair ramp after his stroke. Marcia had threatened him with legal action, claiming it didn't match the aesthetic. Suddenly, she wasn't just the villain of my story, she was the antagonist in a dozen others. But here's the twist. Something else was buried deep in that pile. A copy of a complaint filed by a former HOA board member, one who had mysteriously stepped down last year. It accused Marcia of using HOA funds for personal upgrades, landscaping around her own home. Even a portion of the roof repairs she'd claimed were storm-related but weren't. There were bank statements, handwritten notes, receipts, and it had all been buried. She hadn't just been power-hungry. She had been stealing. And now I had the evidence. At first, I wasn't sure what to do. Turning her in felt heavy, vindictive. But then I remembered Mr. Daniels, Leah's family, the people whose lives had been drenched in mud while Marcia kept her carpets dry. I contacted the local council, then the police. 2 weeks later, they arrested her. It wasn't dramatic, no sirens or cuffs in front of her garage, but the footage still made the news. A former HOA president escorted from her home, wearing a windbreaker and dark glasses, refusing to speak to reporters. The news anchor called it a shocking betrayal of neighborhood trust. That was the final straw for the last of her defenders. At the next community meeting, someone nominated me to the new HOA board. I declined. "I didn't do this to lead," I told them. "I just wanted to be left alone." Instead, I proposed something else. Disband the HOA entirely. A vote was held. Passed with 87% in favor. Willow Creek Estates would now govern itself with town ordinances. Yes, but no clipboard tyrants. No aesthetic tribunals. For the first time in years, people smiled without tight lips. There was one last moment I'll never forget. Weeks after the storm, Leah's father, Mr. Whitaker, invited me to dinner. Over lasagna and lemonade, he thanked me for standing up. "But it wasn't just me," I said. "Your daughter helped expose her." He nodded proudly. "She wants to submit her footage to a national student documentary competition. She's calling it The Flood Next Door." I laughed. "She earned it." Then he added something I'll never forget. There's a difference between keeping things nice and keeping people small. You helped remind us of that. Outside their window, the last of the flood debris was gone. Lawns were green again, but something was different now. Something better. And at the edge of my property, that wooden sign still stood. When control replaces care, consequences flood in. Now, people don't just glance at it. They stop. They read. They nod. Sometimes they knock on my door. To say thank you. To ask for advice. Or just to talk. Because in the end, it wasn't the water that changed this place. It was the truth. A few months passed, and the air in Willow Creek Estates had changed, not just in temperature but in texture. People who used to avoid eye contact over hedges now stood shoulder to shoulder at neighborhood barbecues. Lawns weren't all picture-perfect anymore, but they were honest. Kids drew with sidewalk chalk. Some fences were left a little crooked, and no one came around measuring mailbox heights with a ruler. But peace doesn't always come without echoes. One evening in early spring, I came home to find an envelope taped to my door. No return address. No stamps. Inside was a single photo. It showed a man I didn't recognize, gray hair, slumped shoulders, standing in front of a small one-story home. Scribbled on the back, in rough block letters. She did it to him too. He never recovered. I stared at it for a long time. Eventually, I went to the address cross-referenced from a neighborhood map Leah had helped me digitize. The house was at the edge of the subdivision, barely part of the HOA jurisdiction. I'd never noticed it before. An older woman answered. Her eyes were tired but warm. "You must be here about Frank," she said before I could even introduce myself. She led me inside and offered tea. We sat at a modest kitchen table with faded sunflowers on the tablecloth. "Frank was my brother," she began. "Lived here 10 years before Marcia took over the HOA. What happened?" I asked gently. She looked down at her hands, trembling slightly as they wrapped around the mug. "He was a vet, had PTSD, didn't like a lot of noise or sudden visits. Marcia fined him for keeping his curtains closed during the day. Then for his garden. Then for having a wind chime she said was offensive." Her voice cracked. She had the nerve to tell him it sounded like disorder. I clenched my jaw. "He got tired," she said. "Tired of fighting. One day he just stopped caring. Let the house go. Let himself go." She didn't need to say the rest. I left that house with a heavy heart. The photo now sat on my desk, next to the envelope Marcia had given me. Her attempt at remorse or reputation salvage had accidentally opened another chapter of her destruction. But it also gave me purpose. I contacted the local paper and shared everything, not to gloat, but to warn. We worked on a multi-part expose about unchecked HOA power, featuring stories from all over the state. Frank's story was one of them. And then something unexpected happened. Emails started pouring in. From other neighborhoods, other towns. People telling me about their own Marcias. About unfair citations, threats, even psychological abuse disguised as community regulation. I was overwhelmed at first, but then I realized something. This wasn't just about Willow Creek. This was bigger. So, I started something new. The Barrier Project, named after the wall Marcia tore down. It began as a blog, then grew into a community resource platform. Volunteers helped me create guides for homeowners. How to challenge abusive HOAs, how to recognize unlawful overreach, how to band together and demand reform. We hosted town halls. We filed petitions. We connected legal support with families who thought they had no voice. One story from Arizona really stayed with me. A single mother fined for installing a ramp for her disabled son. We helped her sue and win. As the project grew, so did the sense of something I hadn't felt in a long time, healing. Even Leah joined the team. She ran the youth outreach arm and eventually won second place in the National Student Documentary Contest. Her project didn't just highlight Marcia, it celebrated resistance, resilience, and the power of standing your ground. But not everyone celebrated. About a year later, I saw her again. Marcia. It was by accident. I was attending a civic conference on community governance. She was sitting in the back of the room, alone, wearing a drab gray coat and flat shoes. I recognized her instantly, though she looked older, quieter. When the panel ended, we locked eyes. She walked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "You turned me into a symbol," she said. "No," I answered. "You did that. I just made sure people saw the full picture." She nodded. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. I didn't realize I was protecting my fear." That gave me pause. Fear of what? Of things changing, of people doing things I couldn't control. I thought, order meant safety. She shook her head. But control without compassion is just cruelty. It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard her say. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it. But something passed between USA silent, mutual understanding of the wreckage behind and the rebuilding ahead. As I left the conference center, the rain began to fall. Not a flood, not a storm, just a quiet, cleansing drizzle. I looked back once and she was still there, watching the rain, alone. 1 year after the flood, Willow Creek held its first true community gathering. No agendas. No rules about lawn height or flower color, just people. There were kids selling lemonade and handmade bookmarks, a high school band playing a slightly off-key rendition of Sweet Caroline, and neighbors who had once only exchanged glares now sharing folding chairs and barbecue sauce recipes. At the heart of it all stood a new sign, nailed to a thick cedar plank in the community garden. Burned into the wood with a branding iron, it read, "We choose care over control." It was simple, but it said everything. That day I was invited to speak, not as a leader, not as a victim, just as a neighbor. I walked to the front slowly, memories swimming through my mind like shadows beneath calm water. The sound of floodwaters crashing, the image of Marcia's sneer, the moment I realized the truth would cost more than just bricks and wood. I looked at them, dozens of faces, young and old, bruised and healed, and I told them a story, not about the flood, but about Frank. About the man who had quietly faded under the weight of rules he never asked for, who had served his country, only to be undone by his own neighborhood. I told them about his sister, her trembling voice, her heartbreak, and I told them this: protection means nothing without compassion. Structure without empathy becomes a cage. We all saw what happens when someone like Marcia uses the rules to control instead of to care. But what matters now is what we do next. There was silence when I finished. Not the uncomfortable kind, something softer, like soil after a long rain. Later, a young couple approached me with their toddler. The wife held out a mason jar filled with small stones. "We started this because of you," she said. "Every time someone in the neighborhood helps someone else, we add a stone." Simple, but it's proof. The jar was nearly full. That night, I sat by my back porch, warm mug in hand, the air cool with promise. I looked out at the new barrier, reinforced, city approved, stronger than ever, and beyond it, the houses rebuilt, gardens replanted, lives restored. The sign I had planted after the flood was still there, a little weathered now, but no less clear. When control replaces care, consequences flood in. I thought of Leah, now interning at a local journalism program, of Mr. Daniels, whose ramp finally got installed by a team of volunteers, of Frank, whose story helped change more than just one community. And yes, I thought of Marcia. I hadn't seen her since the conference. Word was she had moved to a small town upstate. No HOA, just trees, a general store, and quiet. Sometimes I wondered if she found peace, or if guilt stayed with her, trailing behind like a shadow that never quite lets go. I didn't hate her anymore, but I didn't forget her either, because forgetting would mean pretending it couldn't happen again. And I knew better now. The Barrier Project kept growing. We expanded beyond our state, then into others. We offered workshops, advocacy toolkits, and something many people had never known they could have: a voice. In time, national outlets picked up the story, not just of the flood, but of the movement that followed. I was invited to speak at a housing policy summit in D.C. One sentence stayed with them: people don't fear rules, they fear rulers. In one town, a corrupt HOA was dissolved. In another, a family won their legal battle to keep their backyard greenhouse. We weren't just stopping injustice, we were planting something better in its place. Empathy, transparency, community. 1 year turned into 2, and on the second anniversary of the flood, I found myself back at the same slope where it all began. I stood where the water had once roared, now a gentle creek running between blooming wildflowers. I remembered everything: the bulldozer, the flood, the silence after, and I remembered how it all changed because someone said, "No more." I knelt down and picked up a smooth stone from the creek bed, etched a word into it with a marker I'd kept since the day I planted the sign. Listen, because sometimes the loudest warnings come from the quietest voices. I added the stone to a second jar, my own, my private ritual. Each stone a reminder of someone who stood up, spoke out, or simply helped rebuild. I didn't need a monument, just that jar, just that sign, and the ripple it left behind. What would you have done if someone like Marcia tore down your protection in the name of power? Do we owe forgiveness to those who only feel regret after causing harm? Or is justice enough? Tell me what you believe, because in the end, it's not just about what happened. It's about what we choose to do next.